If you've been watching The Crown on Netflix, you already know Tommy Lascelles, played by Pip Torrens as the thin-lipped keeper of the institutional conscience, the private secretary who understood, better than any elected politician, that the monarchy wasn't a family, but a mechanism, and that mechanisms required maintenance. And if you know Lascelles, you know that the figure who concentrated every fear he had about the institution into one human being wasn't a foreign government, not a constitutional reformer, not a press baron. She was a twice-divorced American woman from Baltimore who held no office, commanded no army, and controlled not a single vote. The Crown gave you the shape of the story: the abdication, Edward's famous radio broadcast, the exile in France. Season 1 cast Lia Williams as Wallis. By Season 3, Geraldine Chaplin was playing the older Duchess, brittle and restless in Paris. The show presents the abdication as a crisis filtered through the eyes of a monarchy trying to survive it. What it couldn't give you, in the screen time available, was the character study underneath. This is that character study. Because Wallis Simpson is one of the genuinely contested figures of the 20th century, and the contestation isn't tabloid noise, it runs through the primary sources, through the diaries of the people who knew her, through letters that sat undiscovered in an attic for 55 years, and a cache of private correspondence that a biographer had to travel to a desolate village in Baja California Sur to find. The real question about Wallis Simpson, the one the Crown couldn't resolve because nobody can, is whether she was the most calculating social operator of the century, a Baltimore outsider who engineered herself to within one ecclesiastical ruling of the British throne, or a woman who tried to stop a constitutional earthquake and discovered she couldn't escape a man whose obsession with her was stronger than his commitment to his kingdom. The evidence, maddeningly, supports both verdicts. She was, in a phrase that has stuck to her for 90 years, a constitutional hazard in excellent clothes. And it's time to examine both the hazard and the excellence. Her father died 5 months after she was born. Teakle Wallace Warfield died of tuberculosis on November 15, 1896, leaving his wife Alice and their infant daughter in what biographers call genteel poverty, dependent on the charity of wealthier Baltimore relatives, living, in one account, adrift in Baltimore, in hotels and apartment houses. The family had social standing and no money to underwrite it. She was born on June 19, 1896, at Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, a summer resort straddling the Mason-Dixon line. She was christened Bessie Wallis. She dropped the Bessie early, apparently decided it sounded like a cow, and went by Wallis, a name drawn from her grandfather's illustrious friend, Severn Teakle Wallis, an author and legislator, which tells you something about the family's attachment to a patrician identity it could barely afford. Her uncle, Solomon Warfield, postmaster of Baltimore and later president of the Continental Trust Company, paid her school fees. She attended Oldfields, the most expensive girls' school in Maryland. One fellow pupil remembered, "She was bright, brighter than all of us. She made up her mind to go to the head of the class, and she did." She signed the Leavers book with "All is love," while everyone else wrote, "Have a good life." She was always immaculately dressed. She and her mother used a seamstress in Baltimore, cutting pictures from magazines to be copied. She made entrances. The lesson she drew from her early life, according to Anne Seba's research for her biography, That Woman, was twofold and contradictory. She understood that you had to rely on a man. This was the early 20th century, and without one, you had nothing. But she also understood that a man's support was unreliable, because her uncle's allowance arrived irregularly, and her father had not stayed alive. The tension between those two truths would shape her behavior for the next 4 decades. Her first marriage was to Lieutenant Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., U.S. Navy aviator, 8 years her senior, from a stockbroking family in Oak Park, Chicago. She met him in Pensacola, Florida in April 1916, when she was 19. They married on November 8, 1916, at Christ Episcopal Church in Baltimore. Spencer packed a bottle of alcohol in his suitcase for the honeymoon, by Seba's account. He was a heavy drinker. The drinking fueled violence. He locked her in bathrooms. His naval superiors noted in his service records that he had a volatile temper. The promotions he wanted never came. When Wallis asked her Uncle Solomon for help obtaining a divorce, he refused. Nobody in the Warfield family had ever divorced. She would bring shame on the family name, and if she persisted, he told her, he would leave his entire fortune not to her, but to establish a home for indigent gentlefolk in Baltimore, so that everybody would know she had defied the family. She went back to win Spencer. It still didn't work. The divorce was finalized on December 10, 1927. She had already met Ernest Aldrich Simpson. Ernest was Anglo-American. His father had co-founded a successful shipping business. His brother-in-law had been an MP. He had served in the Coldstream Guards and held British citizenship. He divorced his first wife, Dorothea, to marry Wallis. They wed on July 21, 1928, at the Chelsea Register Office in London. They settled into a large flat near Marble Arch. Ernest's shipping business remained prosperous. Wallis became a society hostess. The social pathway to Edward, Prince of Wales, ran through a chain of introductions. Through a friend named Consuelo Thaw, Wallis met Consuelo's sister Thelma, Viscountess Furness, who had been Edward's mistress since 1929 and a regular fixture at his private retreat, Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park. Thelma brought the Simpsons into the circle. Lady Furness introduced Wallis and Ernest to Edward at Borough Court, near Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire. It wasn't love at first sight. Edward continued his affair with Furness. He and Wallis crossed paths at house parties over the following 3 years. The relationship wasn't consummated until January 1934, while Furness was in New York visiting relatives. By the end of that year, Edward was, in the words of his own official biographer Philip Ziegler, slavishly dependent on her. He found, Ziegler wrote, her domineering manner and abrasive irreverence toward his position appealing. Ziegler went further. There must have been some sort of sadomasochistic relationship. Edward relished the contempt and bullying she bestowed on him. That detail is worth pausing on, not for prurience, but for logic. Whatever was happening between Edward and Wallis, the direction of desire wasn't simply a man pursuing a woman. It was a man who required, specifically, a woman who would treat him with imperious authority. Wallis, consciously or not, was precisely that woman. The Crown couldn't fully render this, and without it, the abdication can look like a love story. With it, it looks like something more complicated and darker. Now, the case that she knew exactly what she was doing. Chips Channon, American-born conservative MP, prolific diarist, intimate of the social world surrounding Edward and Wallis, whose unabridged diaries were finally published in 2021 and described as shatteringly honest, wrote on October 7, 1935 that Mrs. Simpson was glittering and dripped in new jewels and clothes. On the power dynamic between them, he was cleaner still. She has complete power over the Prince of Wales, who is trying to launch her socially. Note the grammar. The king was working for Wallis, not the reverse. Neville Chamberlain, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, wrote in his diary that Wallis Simpson was an entirely unscrupulous woman who isn't in love with the king, but is exploiting him for her own purposes. She has already ruined him in money and jewels. Edward had given her jewels worth an estimated £110,000, drawn partly from Queen Alexandra's collection, family heirlooms set aside on the assumption the Prince of Wales would eventually make a suitable dynastic match and need them for his queen consort. The Duke of York watched this happening and noted it with undisguised bitterness. Scotland Yard's special branch was placed on the relationship. Officers interrogated shop owners, opened letters, monitored telephone calls. Their assessment? Wallis and Ernest Simpson were a pair of professional hustlers, preying on the prince for money. Joseph Kennedy, the American ambassador, called her a tart. His wife Rose refused to dine with her. Edward's own equerry wrote privately that she would eventually leave the king, having secured the cash. Her social technique, documented by people who watched it operate, was precise. She would research whoever she was about to meet, learn their world, know their interests, and then, when face-to-face, focus directly on their eyes and make them feel like the only person in the room. Seba, interviewing the daughter of an American who had encountered Wallis in Peking in the mid-1920s, heard a report that Wallis's arrivals at social gatherings were dreaded because it was a bit like having a bitch on heat in the house. Blunt, but consistent with every other account of her effect on a room. She was also described by multiple witnesses as exercising domestic command over Edward in ways that observers found extraordinary. She reportedly seized a carving knife from his hands at dinner and carved the chicken herself, a trivial act that contemporaries cited for years as evidence of who held authority in that household. Marion Crawford, governess to the future Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret, noted that Wallis had a distinctly proprietary way of speaking to the new king. These are small moments, but they were witnessed repeatedly, independently, and by people with no particular reason to fabricate them. After George V died on January 20th, 1936, and Edward acceded to the throne, Wallis was reportedly overheard saying, "Soon I shall be Queen of England." It's a single-source report, colored by the hostility of whoever passed it on, but combined with Chamberlain's diary entry, the intelligence assessments, the financial picture, and the steady testimony of contemporaries, it sits uncomfortably against any portrait of an inadvertent victim. Then there are the letters. When Seba discovered a cache of previously unseen correspondence between Wallis and Ernest Simpson from 1936 to 1937, the picture that emerged was of a woman tracking the financial dimensions of her position with acute attention. She writes to Ernest that she is terrified of the court, that she feels small and licked by it all. One passage, "If I am put on the spot, Ipswich, etc., will be a great waste of time as far as I am concerned," references the Ipswich court where her divorce was processed, and reads like someone calculating the logistics of a transaction against the contingency of it collapsing. A historian who read these letters described Wallis as both scared and grasping. Both, simultaneously. And that simultaneous quality is the first sign that the prosecution and defense are drawing from the same evidence pool. Before we address whether she tried to stop any of this, the title of this video has a promise to keep. Why was Wallis Simpson specifically a constitutional hazard? Not a social inconvenience, not a diplomatic embarrassment, a structural threat to the British constitutional order. Edward VIII held two positions simultaneously. He was sovereign of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India. He was also, by statute, the supreme governor of the Church of England. The Church had reaffirmed its position in 1935. In no circumstances can Christian men or women remarry during the lifetime of a wife or a husband. At the point Edward intended to marry Wallis, she would have two living ex-husbands. The head of a church that forbade the remarriage of divorced persons was proposing to marry a twice-divorced woman. The conflict was direct and, under existing law, irresolvable. The constitutional trap went deeper than theology. Wallis's first divorce had been granted in the United States on grounds of emotional incompatibility. English law at the time recognized only adultery as legitimate grounds for divorce. If that first divorce wasn't valid under English law, and there was a serious legal argument that it wasn't. Then her second marriage to Ernest Simpson was bigamous, which meant her prospective marriage to the king would also be bigamous. Historian Ariane Chernock's formulation is the cleanest available. The church thought divorce was okay, but remarriage wasn't. The law thought the divorce itself might not have been valid. Either path led to the same conclusion. The marriage was constitutionally impossible. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin's argument to Edward was explicitly constitutional rather than moral. Parliament, as representative of the people, held the power to determine who was suitable to be queen consort. If Edward married Wallis against his government's advice, the government would resign en masse. Baldwin had already consulted all 5 Dominion prime ministers, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State. Each concluded independently that a morganatic marriage, the compromise arrangement under which Wallis would be Edward's wife but not queen, with any children excluded from the succession, was also unworkable. The Canadian Prime Minister told Edward to do what he believed in his own heart was right, which was the diplomatic way of saying the Canadian government wouldn't support any version of this marriage. The Irish Free State, as a Roman Catholic country, didn't recognize divorce at all. 3 options were placed before the Dominion governments. Wallis becomes queen. Wallis becomes wife but not queen via morganatic marriage. Or Edward abdicates. All 5 Dominion leaders agreed there was no alternative to option 3. Wallis Simpson didn't choose any of this. She didn't draft the Church of England's canon law or write the statutes governing the king's constitutional obligations. But her existence inside this specific legal framework created a crisis the institution could escape only by removing the king. The institution had to choose between the man and itself. It chose itself. It always does. Archbishop Cosmo Gordon Lang didn't wait for the institution to make its choice quietly. Letters uncovered from Lambeth Palace's archives in 2012 revealed that Lang had been colluding with the editor of The Times, Geoffrey Dawson, threatening to expose the relationship publicly unless Edward abdicated. He wrote to Baldwin, urging that the king must leave as soon as possible. He also, separately, told Dawson that Edward had symptoms of persecution mania and that his obsession was due to a deranged mind. After the abdication, Lang's radio broadcast declared that Edward had prioritized a craving for private happiness over a high and sacred trust. The public reaction was so hostile, it permanently damaged his reputation. Tommy Lascelles, who had rejoined the royal household as assistant private secretary in 1935, had been concerned about Edward's fitness for the throne since 1927, nearly a decade before Wallis Simpson became relevant. That year, while still serving as Edward's private secretary, Lascelles had confided to Stanley Baldwin that he hoped Edward would die in a hunting accident or break his neck rather than inherit the throne. His hostility to Edward predated Wallis entirely. What she represented to men like Lascelles wasn't the cause of the problem, but the moment at which a known problem became impossible to defer. The machine had been quietly preparing this outcome for years before she arrived. She was the catalyst, not the origin. Now the other case, because you deserve both. On October 14th, 1936, approximately 7 weeks before the abdication crisis became public knowledge in Britain, Wallis wrote to Edward, suggesting she abandon her divorce proceedings entirely. She was willing to stay married to Ernest Simpson. She was offering him a way out of the collision course. He declined. When Edward's private secretary, Alexander Hardin, wrote to the king on November 13, 1936, warning that the press silence was about to break and the government was preparing to resign, Wallis read the letter. Her response was immediate. She had to leave the country at once. Edward refused. "You'll do no such thing. I won't have it." She later wrote that this was the fateful moment, the last when any action of mine could have prevented the crisis. That line is self-serving, written decades after the events, and should be treated accordingly. But it's corroborated by every documented action she took in the weeks around it. On December 3, 1936, Wallis left Fort Belvedere for France. Lord Brownlow, the king's equerry, whose diary survived 55 years in an attic at Belton House in Lincolnshire before coming to light, recorded the departure. Edward shook hands with me and leant across to get one touch of her hand. There were tears in his eyes and on his cheeks, and his voice was shaking as he said, "Wherever you reach tonight, no matter what time, telephone me. Bless you, my darling." They drove through the night. They crossed to France from New Haven, arrived in Dieppe in the early hours, unable to find a hotel, drove to Rouen, and booked 4 rooms at the Grand Hotel de la Poste under the name Mr. and Mrs. Harrison. The bill came to 364 francs. Brownlow kept it. At the Villa Louviers near Cannes, the home of her long-standing friends Herman and Catherine Rogers, Wallis was under siege by the press. Anne Seba's research reveals she was also receiving death threats, bomb warnings. Seba's description of her in this period isn't of a woman approaching triumph. She was a desperately unhappy woman terrified of being physically attacked. On December 7, 1936, 3 days before the instrument of abdication was signed, Wallis issued a public statement indicating her readiness to give up Edward. It was drafted with Brownlow. Her solicitor confirmed that his client was ready to do anything to ease the situation, while the other end of the wicket, meaning Edward himself, was determined. She wrote to Brownlow from Cannes, "The merciless attack on me continues. U.S. Press, English Post, I am weary of all things. But what does hurt most is to see England turn on the one that has done so much for her always. I couldn't believe that in a country which is supposed to be the most sportsmanlike in the world, they would hit a man when he is down." Those letters weren't written for posterity. They sat in an attic for 55 years. They aren't the voice of a woman who had succeeded. Andrew Morton's 2018 book, Wallis in Love, advances the interpretation, drawn from an interview conducted 80 years after the events, that Wallis's true attachment wasn't to Edward at all, but to Herman Rogers, the American friend at whose villa she sheltered. If that reading holds even partially, it transforms the prosecution case entirely. A woman not in love with the king, who offered to abandon her divorce proceedings, who issued a public statement offering to give him up, who was sheltering under death threats in a foreign villa while he signed an irrevocable document. This isn't a calculated climber on the verge of triumph. This is someone swept into a situation by another person's will and unable to get out. Walter Monckton, the barrister who served as Edward's primary advisor through the crisis, wrote that Edward felt that he and Mrs. Simpson were made for each other. Lord Beaverbrook's summary was bleaker. Edward followed a policy of total drift which carried him inevitably to disaster. His official biographer concluded he had become slavishly dependent on Wallis. The psychohistorical analysis of the abdication, published in the Journal of British Studies, argues that Edward was seeking in Wallis a resolution to psychological conflicts that had nothing to do with love in any conventional sense, conflicts rooted in his ambivalent relationship to the kingship itself, a kingship he had been signaling for years he didn't want. Wallis couldn't stop a man in total drift. The evidence says she tried. On December 10, 1936, at Fort Belvedere, Edward signed the instrument of abdication, witnessed by his 3 brothers, Albert, Henry, George. The following day, Parliament passed His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act, introduced by Baldwin, supported by Attlee as leader of the opposition, passed in a single day with no amendments. The vote against an amendment to abolish the monarchy altogether, 403 to 5. That evening, Edward broadcast to the nation. He had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. Wallis heard this from Cannes. He became Duke of Windsor. Her divorce from Ernest became absolute in May 1937. They married on June 3, 1937, in the south of France, with no member of the royal family in attendance. George VI refused to grant Wallis the title Royal Highness. She was Duchess of Windsor, without the HRH. This distinction, apparently ceremonial, became the central wound of the exile that followed. Edward spent 30 years trying to have it reversed. The royal family refused until his death. Queen Mary refused to receive Wallis until her own death in 1953. In October 1937, the Duke and Duchess visited Germany and met Adolf Hitler at Berchtesgaden, without government approval and over British objections. Philip Ziegler's official biography of Edward argues that nothing in the German archives indicates Wallis or anyone close to Edward passed intelligence to Berlin. But the visit happened, the photographs exist, and the impression it created of a former British king apparently at ease in the company of fascist leadership attached itself to both their reputations permanently. Whether Wallis understood the political implications fully or shared Edward's apparent comfort with the regime, the documents don't conclusively establish. What is documented is that she went. The decades of exile that followed, shuttling between Paris and New York, giving dinner parties for a steadily contracting circle of friends, being photographed endlessly in the same immaculate clothes, was its own kind of sentence. Edward died of throat cancer on May 28, 1972. Wallis survived him by 14 years in increasing seclusion, rarely seen in public, increasingly frail. She died on April 24, 1986, at her Paris home, aged 89. Her body was brought to England. She was buried at Windsor alongside Edward. The palace that had treated her as an enemy for half a century gave her, in the end, the same ground as the king. So, here is the verdict the evidence won't deliver. If Wallis Simpson was a calculated operator, she was one of the least successful in recorded history. She didn't become queen. She never received the title the palace denied her. She spent 30 years in a Paris exile that dwindled, year by year, into isolation and irrelevance. If this was a scheme, the return on investment was catastrophic. And if she was a woman who stumbled accidentally into history, she stumbled with remarkable precision. Harold Nicolson, whose literary judgment was among the sharpest of the era, called her one of the most amazing queens since Cleopatra. Cecil Beaton, who had photographed almost everyone worth photographing in the 20th century, was ravished by her. She commanded rooms. She dressed with a ferocity of intention that her own words explain better than any biographer's. I'm not a beautiful woman. I'm nothing to look at, so the only thing I can do is dress better than anyone else. That isn't the statement of a woman drifting through events. It's the statement of someone who has been working the problem of herself since Baltimore. The most honest reading is that both things were simultaneously true, and that she herself may not have known where the calculation ended and the feeling began. She was a woman who had spent her entire life learning how to be necessary to powerful men, and then encountered the one man whose need for her was so absolute that there was no way to make herself unnecessary. She applied every skill she had to Edward, and found herself managing a man who would give up everything rather than be managed, whose need she could neither fully return nor fully escape. She was dangerous not because she wanted to be queen. The evidence that she actively sought the throne is thin and largely inferential. She was dangerous because the man who loved her was the king, and the king's love was a structural fact about the British constitutional order that the British Constitution had no mechanism to absorb. Her existence inside this specific legal framework forced an institutional crisis. She didn't design the framework. She didn't choose to become a structural problem. She became constitutionally threatening through no act of deliberate aggression, but through the combination of who she was, what she had learned to do, and the particular psychology of the man who couldn't let her go. Whether she was guilty of anything depends entirely on what you think the crime was. Here is what remains when the analysis is done. Institutions survive because someone inside them is willing to be the institutional villain, the cold, clear voice that says, "This person is incompatible with this role. The man matters less than the mechanism, and the mechanism will be maintained." Tommy Lascelles played that role. He had been preparing to play it since 1927, when he told Baldwin he'd prefer Edward dead in a riding accident to Edward on the throne. It was brutal. It was also, by the outcome, correct. The Archbishop, the Prime Minister, the Dominion governments, the press barons, who maintained their voluntary silence until silence became unsustainable. All of them understood what needed to happen and had the authority and the will to ensure it happened. The abdication was processed cleanly. The monarchy survived. The question that surfaces, persistently, in serious discussion of the modern British monarchy is, who does that job now? When Harry and Meghan's departure from the working royal family became a permanent global media event from 2020 onwards, there was no Lascelles figure deploying calibrated pressure through proper channels. No archbishop writing letters to the prime minister. No government prepared to put its full authority behind an institutional position. Just a family argument, aired serially across streaming services and television interviews, because nobody with institutional standing seemed either willing or able to resolve it on institutional terms. The difference between 1936 and now isn't that the monarchy faces smaller problems. The difference is that it appears to have lost the internal apparatus for managing them. Wallis Simpson was a constitutional hazard in excellent clothes. The institution survived her because it had people who were prepared to be as ruthless as the situation required. What the palace may have lost in the decades since isn't an enemy worth fighting. It's the willingness to fight at all. And perhaps that's what people are really reaching for when they reach for Lascelles, when they reach for Wallis, when they reach for 1936. Not what happened then. What is missing now? If you want more stories like this, subscribe. There are many, and they reward the time.